Hello, I'm Matthew. I'm the lead pastor here at Cedar. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We are really glad you're here. If you're joining us live on Zoom, thank you for being here, and please take advantage of the chat facility we have. You can interact and leave comments and thoughts in the chat box. Please do that throughout the service, and including in this message. We're in a series at the moment called Reimagining Church, and we're recognizing the fact that we're living in really uncertain circumstances, quite confusing at times, chaotic circumstances. We've got the pandemic with all the restrictions. Our culture seems so broken. There's so much polarization, so much injustice, so much hatred even. And what does it mean to be church and do church in this context, in a rapidly changing context too? So we've been looking back a little bit at the early church, the first followers in the time of Jesus and then after Jesus, and looking for ways that we can glean learnings from their experience, because they had very difficult circumstances too. If you think about it, it was constantly changing for them. They had to deal with the death of Jesus, then Jesus coming back to life, then Jesus leaving them, and them sort of leading on their own and trying to work it all out, and succeeding at times and failing at times, and getting attacked and persecuted and then dispersed, having to work out what does this way of Jesus look like in new context, in new cultures, as it moved from the Jewish culture into the pagan culture. So they were constantly having to reinvent themselves, reimagine what it looked like, to adapt and evolve. So I think one of the prevailing things we've seen as we've looked back to try and learn from them is just the amazing amount of diversity there was in their community, but also the incredible amount of love. So even though it was very diverse, they were very different, there was something very unifying about their followership of Jesus. We've seen over the last couple of weeks, for instance, how the following Jesus transcended the ethnic differences and ethnic barriers between the followers, Jewish people and Gentile people, for instance. We've seen how it transcended religious practice. Last week, Ruth mentioned about the council at Jerusalem, where the Jewish believers and the Gentile believers came together to work out, okay, what does it really mean to follow Jesus in our religious practice when we come from such different backgrounds? And they were constantly trying to work these things out together. We see it transcending geographical barriers as they spread out. We have a situation where the original church in Jerusalem is going through a hard time due to a famine, and the other churches that are miles away in pagan areas collect money and send it back to them. They still felt very connected, even though they were geographically very separate and could have gone their own separate ways. So we see that kind of in the church at large, but we also see it within specific communities. Paul, who was one of the sort of key leaders in this early Jesus movement. We'll be talking a bit more about him and his relevance to this in a moment. But he really encouraged, even within a given gathering in a particular city or a particular place, that there should be unity, that people should respect one another, value one another. In his letter to the church at Corinth, the first one that we have in our Bibles, he talks about the church and the community as being like a body. Here's what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free. And we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. And Paul there is making a really important point, something that he really cares passionately about. And it's this issue that everybody belongs, everybody is important. And he uses this analogy of water for the Spirit. He says, we've all been baptized into one Spirit. In other words, we've all been immersed in the Spirit of God. So we are within God. God is all around us. And we've all been given the same Spirit to drink. It's like the Spirit is inside us. So God is inside us and all around us. We sometimes talk about the metaphor of being sponges in an ocean when we think about our relationship to God. We're sponges surrounded by God and soaking God up. So we're surrounded and have God all inside us. God is accessible fully for all of us, all the time, anywhere. And that was so important for Paul. And it brought him at times into conflict with other people who were coming from a more religious background. And Paul himself had a very religious background, but he saw the essence of following Jesus, the essence of the message of Jesus, if you like, as being inclusivity, that everybody belongs. We belong to one another and we belong to God. And that brought him into conflict at times with people who felt that, no, the way to belong to God is through the right religious practice, or being in the, if you like, being in the right place at the right time with the right beliefs. And we're going to see one of those conflicts in a moment, because what I want to talk about a little bit today is the fact that even though there was incredible unity in the church amidst all the diversity, it wasn't like they all just joined hands and skipped off into the sunset and lived happily ever after. It was messy, it was complicated, there was falling out as well, and sometimes they had to take someone had to take a stand on things, which itself created more tension and even resulted in some division at times. So I want to look at a couple of examples of that in Paul's life. And you may remember that Paul was initially a persecutor of the church. He was a Pharisee, a very zealous Pharisee, and he was a violent persecutor of the church. But he had this amazing encounter with Jesus, where he had this vision of Jesus, it seems. And this is after Jesus' death and resurrection, and he became a follower. And he was befriended by somebody called Barnabas, but when he became a follower, it was like the rest of the church didn't really trust him. They were like, is he pulling a fast one here? Is this a trick? Is this fake? Should we believe him? But Barnabas, who was one of the early church leaders as well, kind of with some encouragement, went to see Paul and really kind of took him under his wing. And helped him integrate into the Jesus movement and become accepted. So they had a very close relationship. But they fell out. They had this falling out. And we read about that in Acts chapter 15. So let's just look at that now. It's just a very brief passage where they talk about this difficulty that they had. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how things are going." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So there's this falling out between them, and we're not exactly sure of all the details. It's around a person, John Mark, who was in favour with Barnabas, but Paul kind of felt he had let him down. The exact nature of the disagreement resulted in them going their separate ways. And I think that it's important we look at this kind of conflict as a very, it's interesting that it's shared with us in the scriptures. It's a very real, very practical issue when you disagree with somebody. And what's interesting, I think, is that we could look at this in a very negative light. We could say, it's kind of petty, and where's the sort of power of the Spirit of God unifying them in that situation? But what's interesting, I think, is that they don't try to force each other to come around to their own opinion. They kind of respect one another's opinion, and because of that respect, they decide to go in their separate ways. They're not compromising themselves. They feel strongly about the issue enough to stay in their own position, but they're not trying to overwhelm the other person. We actually see later on, I think, some hints that they kind of, whether they reconciled or not exactly, but they certainly still had a lot of respect for one another and kind of affection for one another. In some of the writings that are ascribed to Paul, in 2 Timothy, for instance, and in Colossians, Paul references both Barnabas and John Mark again in very warm, positive terms. So it wasn't like this was a parting of the ways where they hated each other and there's a lot of enmity between them, but they seem to have agreed to disagree. And there's still love there, but they don't want to compromise their own position, and they don't want to disrespect the other person by forcing them to change, and they go their separate ways. And that's one way that they dealt with conflict, it seems, in these early days. Unity was not forced. It wasn't something that came from power and control. It came through love, and sometimes that means having to go separate ways. I'm sure that was very painful, though, especially because of their close connection, close relationship. But I think it shows just how powerfully convicted many of these early followers were about what it really meant to follow Jesus. They kind of felt they had to hold to the truth as they perceived it. And we see that in another example of some falling out, if you like, or some conflict in the early church, in the book of Galatians, another letter that Paul wrote. And let's just read from the second chapter, kind of will set up what this conflict, this confrontation is all about. Here's what it says in Galatians chapter 2. This is Paul speaking, but when Peter came to Antioch, I had to oppose him to his face, for what he did was very wrong. When he first arrived, he ate with the Gentile believers who were not circumcised. But afterward, when some friends of James came, Peter wouldn't eat with the Gentiles anymore. He was afraid of criticism from these people who insisted on the necessity of circumcision. As a result, other Jewish believers followed Peter's hypocrisy, and even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. So Peter here is setting up an argument he's having with what he calls the Jewish believers, the people who, Paul, let's remember again, Paul is Jewish. But there were a group of believers, and they included Peter and apparently Barnabas as well, and James, who was the brother of Jesus. So some really key figures in this early Jesus movement. Paul is in conflict with them because they are saying that Gentile people, pagan people, people who are not from a Jewish background, if they want to follow Jesus, they have to be kind of incorporated into the Jewish religion. That's how you come to Jesus. It has to be through that religious route, and you have to practice all the Jewish requirements of the law. And Paul, this is totally wrong in Paul's view. And we've kind of had a hint of that in what he said in 1 Corinthians. For Paul, the way of Jesus is all about inclusivity. It's not about excluding people. It's about including everyone. Everyone belongs. Everyone has contact and connection to God. Everyone belongs to one another. We're all in this together, which is the title of the message today. And so he's actually in many respects anti-religious in the same way that Jesus was anti-religious. Jesus was coming to set us free from religion, free from those restrictions, to really have direct connection to God, direct connection to the Spirit of God, and to see our oneness with God and our oneness with all of humanity. So this is a massive issue for Paul. And Paul isn't here just saying, oh, let's agree to disagree. Let's just sort of, well, that's your thought, this is my thought. He's been very strong about this. He goes on in chapter 3 to use some pretty strong language because he's worried that the Galatian church is being led astray in this religious way. Here's what it says. O foolish Galatians, who has cast an evil spell on you? For the meaning of Jesus Christ's death was made clear to you as if you had seen a picture of his death on the cross. Let me ask you this one question. Did you receive the Holy Spirit by obeying the law of Moses? Of course not. You received the Spirit because you believed the message you heard about Christ. How foolish can you be? After starting your new lives in the Spirit, why are you now trying to become perfect by your own human effort? Have you experienced so much for nothing? Surely it was not in vain, was it? So he's challenging them to follow him, if you like, in his perspective, which is that Jesus is all about inclusivity. It's not about religious rules and regulations. It's about direct access to God through the Spirit. He goes on later in that chapter to say, For you are all children of God through faith in Christ Jesus, and all have been united with Christ in baptism and have put on Christ, like putting on new clothes. There is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. He goes on in chapter 5, in the first verse, to say, So Christ has truly set us free. Now make sure that you stay free and don't get tied up again in slavery to the law. So this is high stakes for Paul. For Paul, there's two ways of keeping unity. One is through conformity, which is through control. Making everybody the same, making everybody behave the same, and that's a very controlling way of doing it. The other is through inclusivity, which comes through freedom. And for Paul, freedom and inclusivity are all about Jesus. And the religious way, the way of conformity and control, is the antithesis of Jesus. So he's making this point very strongly, with no compromise, and he's confronting control and power. And this is another way in which falling out can happen or conflict can happen, when we know we need to confront something that's just wrong. And for Paul, the exclusion that was happening and the control that was happening here require confrontation. And he's been incredibly courageous because he's setting himself up against people with really great credentials. Peter, one of the first followers of Jesus, James, Jesus' brother, and the sort of power of the mother church in Jerusalem. But he's doing it because he believes so passionately that it's the way, and it's making a way for others to come. He's making a way for people from Gentile cultures or Gentile ethnicity, from pagan cultures, to be able to follow Jesus and be part of this Jesus movement. The movement, had it not been for Paul, I think it's fair to say, would have looked very different. It would have become much more religious. But for Paul, this was worth staying and fighting for. It was so important. And I think we have some of that in our own history as a church community here. There are things that we believe passionately about, and they're not always popular. And sometimes they can cause division. The irony here, I think, is that Paul is talking about inclusivity, but being so pro-inclusivity results in offending some other people and indirectly, I guess, in some ways excluding those other people, or those people feeling that they're excluded. But whenever barriers were put up, Jesus brought those barriers down, and Paul is doing the same thing. In our church here at Cedar Ridge, for instance, we've taken a stand on being inclusive of all people, regardless of their sexuality, and that resulted in some conflict many years ago when we took that approach. And for some people, it resulted in them feeling that they couldn't be part of this church anymore. And that's sad, it's hard, but it's reality when we take stands on issues of justice and on issues of inclusivity. I think we've always got to keep love at the fore, though, right? We should never, even when we have those kinds of disagreements, strong disagreements, judge other people or vilify other people or condemn them or cry heretic and that kind of thing. And always respect and love other people, even though we go in different directions and come to different conclusions. So it was messy back in that day, just as it is messy in our day. And I think what we see as church history panned out is actually there was a lot more temptation and giving in to the lure of power and control. They were in difficult times, very confusing times. I mean, for instance, as things went on, many of them expected Jesus to return very quickly within their lifetimes. And Jesus has kind of hinted at that if you read some of Jesus' statements. So there was very much a sense that this is going to be a short-lived movement. Jesus is going to come back. But after a while, they realized that wasn't going to happen. And so they had to start organizing themselves for the long term and bringing in structure and some of the original eyewitnesses of Jesus' original followers, the apostles and others, began to die. And so there was a sort of second generation of leadership, and authority was questioned, and who's in charge now, and what merits you to have authority. And a lot of these challenges came in along with all the spreading of the movement into new cultures and new areas. It required an adjustment that often meant control came in. And I think we can empathize with that. We can look back, I think, at the way church history went and some of the abuse of power that there's been over the last 2 millennia in church. But also, I think, to some degree, empathize with the fact that they were afraid. They wanted, not just afraid of failure and persecution and that kind of thing, and wanting to protect themselves, but are probably afraid of not wanting to mess it up, not wanting to disappoint Jesus, wanting, when things started getting out of hand or getting out of control in their view, or there were new experiences which were outside of their own paradigm, they didn't want to let Jesus down, and they sort of defaulted back to conformity, to control. And I think it's important we recognize that we are prone to those same kind of things because we live in very uncertain times. We live with all kinds of challenges. We've talked about the current situation with our pandemic and the restrictions and the sort of confusion that it causes, and our worlds have been turned upside down. We live in a polarized society, terribly polarized, where there's diametrically opposed views within friendships and within families, and relationships have been torn apart, and our society's been torn apart. There's so much hatred, it seems, and then there's so many different opinions about what's true, and can we really trust the truth? There's this term that's been coined, fake news, which seems to just throw confusion and disorientation into just about any conversation. We disregard science, we disregard opinion that really has been counted on for a lot of progress and a lot of human history. And it's I think destabilized us. We question now pretty much everything we believe. Are our political views or that person's political views really just a product of an algorithm on social media rather than the truth? We're in a very confused state. And I think in those confused states, it's very easy to resort to certainty, conformity, and control, where we try to force people into thinking and believing a certain kind of way. I mean, it's in climates like this that totalitarianism arises, and in fact, it would seem that for some totalitarian type leaders, it's in their interest to create a fearful, uncertain, afraid environment where they can be the strong person who kind of brings all the clarity. And I think that's always a challenge for us in our culture and in our churches. And so I wanted to just share a few thoughts about how we might be very conscious of the way we might lean in that direction or be prone to it because we're human beings, but how also we can perhaps guard against it, and some things that we can do to reimagine church, respond to the current situation we're in, recognizing some of the struggles that they went through in those early days, and apply them into our own situation here. So I just got 5 points. They're as I often say, I don't think any of these are really unbelievably out of the box or stuff that we haven't heard about before or haven't thought about before. But I think they're all kind of challenging things to do and be and live. So we'll look at some of them again. The first one is to be the change. And, in other words, it's not so much about what we say. It's not about doctrine and statements of faith and that kind of thing for us, our spirituality. It's about what we do, who we are. It's incarnational. It's the degree to which we can live it out, which is really important. And I think that sort of shifts things away from you're right, I'm wrong, and a hypothetical, abstract argument to what really works. What does love really look like? What does kindness look like in practice? And if we can't live it, if we can't live that out, then really we have no right talking about it. And I take this very seriously as a leader. I'm a leader in this community along with other people, and that means I have some authority. And I could use that authority to get my way done, if you like, and try to bring some conformity and pressure people into seeing things my way, believing things my way. But perhaps really what authority is about is more about responsibility. As a leader, I just have greater responsibility to be loving, to be inclusive, to break down barriers that keep people out. And to be more kind. Whether I am that or not is another matter, but that's my responsibility. That's what the nature of leadership is like, and I think that's true for all of us, whether we're leading in churches or in workplaces or in our families, in our neighborhoods, whatever kind of influence we have. Can we be the change and live this out? And I think that comes with some inherent challenges as well, because, for instance, in our community, we're saying that everybody belongs. We share perspectives. I'll do that all the time, but I'm not trying to force people to necessarily agree with me, including in this message. So you can make some comments in the chat if you have thoughts about this. But that leads to some messiness. It means that we're not necessarily all on the same page about everything, and sometimes we prefer it to be less messy, and a bit of conformity might feel more comfortable. But I think it's less healthy, and it's less the way of Jesus. So we kind of have to, in being the change, we have to also live with some of that messiness. Second point is keep grounded. It's in these times it can be hard to keep grounded. We talk a lot here about about tradition, experience, and reason. If we think about our traditions, and our tradition of Scripture, for instance, that has been handed down to us through the years, the tradition of the church, and the fact that many mistakes have been made, but there's some rich wisdom and great love that's been passed along, and staying rooted in that, not just throwing it all out because it's a confusing time, or we feel like things have moved on, but recognizing that there's some real value there. And appreciating it and respecting it, and not thinking that we're necessarily better than the people that went before us. But at the same time, valuing our own experience. So tradition, experience, and reason. Our own experience is very different. We're in a very different situation to the first century church, very different to the church 1,000 years ago. And so we're having to work things out for ourselves and in our context with new understandings and new experience. And we need to do that in a very reasoned way. We can't just disregard science. We can't disregard what that has brought to us as a human race. And so we have to bear in mind come to some logical conclusions, some reasoned conclusions. We have to think through things carefully and thoughtfully, and at times slowly, perhaps not rushing to conclusions, but weighing up all the evidence. And these can all help keep us grounded when life can seem somewhat crazy. So tradition and our own experience and a reasoned approach can really help us with that. Thirdly, let's be true to ourselves. Be true to yourself. What I mean there is that I think a lot of times, and I think this is probably true of many of us at Cedar Ridge, the truths that we felt helped us in the past, or that seemed non-negotiable or just absolute, sometimes stop working for us. Stuff happens, we see things in a new light. They're just not working anymore, and we have to rethink and reinvent ourselves, reimagine our faith, reimagine our theology. And I think that can be a very painful and difficult thing. And because it's destabilizing and it's a painful process to go through. And very often we end up not coming to anywhere near as certain conclusions as we started that process. So it's kind of like about living with tension and living with mystery, and that itself can be uncomfortable. But let's be true to ourselves. Let's not either run away and just sort of give up because things are so confusing. But let's also not hide behind sort of religious platitudes or religious dogma that we don't necessarily really live because we don't really believe it. But let's be honest with ourselves and really wrestle through things. Let's not look for somebody else to solve all our problems and come up with the truth and certainty, but work that out ourselves. Again, that's something we do a lot of here at Cedar Ridge. In some ways, it's easier if somebody says, "Here's what the truth is," and we all just follow it. Then that's very easy. But it's got to be true for us, and we've got to work it out. We've got to own it and live it and be it. And that, as I say, that can be difficult. But let's do that rather than necessarily looking for everybody else to do that for us. And then that brings in the fourth point, which is that can be a lonely process. So we need each other. And it's not that we need each other because we need everybody to agree with us and sort of validate our old opinions or our new opinions or whatever. But we need one another because it's a lonely process. And so that's why we encourage people to get into groups. We have, for instance, discussion questions for this series, which you can download from our website. And you have a discussion about the topics that we're looking at and what you think, and listen to what other people think. That way we can help support one another, encourage one another. Sometimes when we talk things out, it helps us just even get a better handle on what we think and where we're coming from, rather than it all just going around in our heads. And also we get to be challenged by somebody else's perspective. So it's a way of supporting one another. We don't necessarily have to agree with one another, but we can still be supportive of encouraging that person to pursue their line of thinking, to wrestle with what it really means to follow Jesus, even if they're coming away with different conclusions. And then finally, let's never stop loving. We say this, I think, pretty much every week. Love is the greatest. So in all the conflicts, in all the confusion, in all the disagreements, in all the parting of ways at times, we can still love and remain committed to love. And we should do that. If we get shifted away from love, even though we're going to take a stand on things that we care passionately about, and I think it's fair to say that we're doing that as a church community, and it's not always comfortable. But as we take those stands, we should never stop loving our enemies. Once we do that, it's like it's game over. We've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. We've missed the whole point. So let's not vilify other people. Let's vehemently disagree and stand our ground on things that we passionately believe are about following Jesus. But let's not vilify the other. Let's not put the other down. Let's not dehumanize the other. But always remain loving and tender-hearted, which is the characteristic that Jesus brought, and that which makes room for us with all our failings and all our difficulties and all our struggles. So I hope those points are helpful. As I said, there's discussion questions this week. You can check those out, and we dig a little bit deeper into each of those. We're going to transition to communion now, so you may want to get a little bit of bread or crackers and wine or something to drink. And it's a time when we celebrate our union with one another, our union with God. It's like we're being immersed in, remembering that we're immersed in the Spirit of God, all of us, that we're all in this together, not because of control, not because of conformity, but because we've been set free and we're all included. So as we approach communion, let's just take a moment to reflect on that with a moment of silence, and then we'll have communion.